Here's we are back. What's up, everybody? It's Mr. Drew here to welcome you to another episode of the Glowczewski Experience. We are at episode 110, character concept art. I want to apologize just up front. I don't know what happened with last night's stream. The internet cut off, or the power went out. My bad. The power went out for a second. I heard my backup go off, and yeah, it's only a matter of seconds after that before the stream cuts and all that. So that's what happened. Um, really didn't miss much. I know I started inking. I forget like where I was when it went out. I think I might have been like on the third character here, or, third drawing here, and I was just like, you know what, if it's cutting off here, let me just finish this row, and I just finished that part. I didn't move on to the other set, so that's what we're gonna work on in this stream. I'm guessing I'll ink this, we'll color it, and yeah, we'll just let that be. So yeah, let me just get back to inking. Um, Grab my brushes and yeah, I got a podcast playing in the background, of course. It's at the end of Fighter and the Kids podcast, and they're talking about Chet Hanks. So if you don't know, Tom Hanks has a son named Chet Hanks, and he's been making rounds on social media in the past couple years. Oh wow. But yeah, so just drama going on with Chet Hanks. Another one. I guess they're doing like current event stuff. So they're just talking about monkey reuniting with the family, or or a chimp that was like people were helping when he was a baby chimp, and they're reuniting, and the chimp recognized them. Those are always fun little videos. Bring a bit of, for lack of a better term, a bit of humanity to animals that we more or less don't expect stuff like that from. But obviously we focus a lot on like the dangers of animals and things like that. But not to say that chimps aren't dangerous, they certainly are. But hey, man, this one likes these people. You don't want to hurt them. Okay. I forgot to promote this. I was gonna make an IG video. Damn it! I was getting ready to go live, and then I said, you know what? Let me look up a couple things, and then I'll go live. And then after I looked up those couple things, I forgot to make my IG video. Damn it! I told myself I'd try to get better at that. Okay. Now that I'm inking this, I gotta say, I've been watching David Finch ink lately. Well, not even just ink, but draw. He'll live stream his art. David Finch is like a really well-known uh, comic book artist. He's a comic book artist master, whatever you want to call him. Guy definitely knows what he's doing. But yeah, I noticed he does like pencil sketches, and then he just outlines the character in pencil, and he doesn't really do any inking or anything like that. He'll just do some clean pencil lines, and then when it comes to inking, he figures that out on the fly. Man, I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I'd be able to do that right away. Yesterday I was talking about how these streams have brought me back to drawing. After, spending years off to write the story, now that I'm drawing it, and working on all this concept art for it, it's it's been super dope. So yeah, I think a lot of what I'm doing now is just warming back up. Even though I've worked on like a couple maps and half a dozen characters and a dozen like environment pieces. Like even though I'm doing all that work, like maybe I'm still like rusty. 5 years is a long time to really take off from anything and any practice or any craft or anything like that. So hopefully, given uh, some time and keeping up with this daily, will but yeah, maybe it saves David Finch some time to not have to do any of the pencil renders. I'm trying to recall one of his more recent videos or tutorials where he drew a zombie, and that one was hella rendered out. I'm trying to remember if he did that with, if he rendered it with pencils or if he did all that with ink. Yeah, I can't really remember. There we go. Oh yeah, let me, I forgot to adjust the camera. Let's get that top down. No wonder it was at the bottom of the screen. I was like, I'm holding it in the right position. Why is it so low on the screen? It's down near the top half of the page. So yeah, I don't know what's been going on with the internet. Like I don't know why it's been cutting out lately. Weather hasn't been bad. Wind's not crazy. Not really raining. Like it rained for like a day or two over the weekend. Like so I don't know why the internet's cutting out. I know when I go for my runs and I go outside, they've been doing some work. Like they've been doing some work out there, but not like on the lines or anything like that. Like I don't know what work they're doing, but yeah, just I don't know why internet would be shoddy, but yeah, it was weird seeing those connection issues for the past couple of days. Obviously, I hope they figure it out soon. Go. Yeah. What I what I really like about all these designs is, hey, what's up, viewer? I see somebody joined. How you doing? What I'm really enjoying about this character is because he's in kind of colder temperatures. Is like all the layering I get to do. You know. Oh my God, they watching more Vin Diesel stuff. Oh my God, Vin Diesel's so weird. If you haven't watched Vin Diesel on social media, he's so weird. Um, but yeah, because he's in colder temperatures, I get to like throw all these layers on him, and I get to have fun with his design, make it a little less basic. Um, because I'm sure, like, you know, you could only make so many like karate outfits. You know what I'm saying? Like, you could only make so many gis out there. You could only make so many before you're just like, you know, you, and like I said, this show that I'm working on is kind of like a fighting video game, the animation. Like, it's just heavily inspired by everything that I wanted to work on, and fighting video games is one of them. So when I work on these fighter characters, like as opposed to like the monster characters that you see me work on, Um, when I work on these fighters, there's only so much you could do. Like, can you throw a fighter in any type of clothing? Absolutely. Like, you don't have to lock into just fighting gis and whatever. Like, that's true. But what am I doing here? All right. Damn, what was I talking about? I got distracted. They're talking about some on the podcast, some video of a barber shaving his head bald because he had to shave some guy bald because he had cancer or something like that. So the barber also shaved his head bald in order to make the cancer guy feel better. Pretty sure that seen all that before, but it's still a kind gesture. Plus, you got to think a barber. Who's gonna know better than a barber? Like, oh, the hair's gonna grow back. you know, he's like, I could shave my head. Like the hair is gonna grow back. So yeah, it's kind to just try to empathize or sympathize with people about things. Yeah, but what was I talking about? Was I talking about like fighters and how there's only so many outfits and whatever. The only thing that's kind of setting mine apart is, well, I guess this plays more into a commentary of how I see fighting games. And yeah, I guess before I say anything, I don't want to say like, oh, I'm right and they're wrong. It's more like because I'm creating something, I want to I wanted to create something, you know, that's derivative but not completely derivative of just fighting games. Um, because now the state of fighting games has advanced, and since I was a kid, and playing Street Fighter 2 in the 90s, um, playing Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat and stuff like that in the 90s, like fighting games have come a long way. Where now they're, I mean, we even have like the sports fighting games now with like UFC and things like that, and um, I mean, there's all sorts of them where you fight with weapons, you don't fight with weapons. There's anime ones like Skullgirls and and like Guilty Gear, things like that. So like the state of fighting games is kind of crazy as far as like scope goes and how many there are and you know which ones are successful and things like that. And we'll forget about success, but just the variety of them. And then those are just the ones that we know about. What about all the obscure ones that we never learn about? And there's a lot of fighting games out there. Ones that are just monster based. ones that are more traditional fighters, and so yeah, when I knew that I was gonna be when I started writing this story, and I'm inspired by these fighting games. Like once you start like looking into all of them and researching all of them and things like that. Uh, do I have my water, or is my water still in bed? If I not drink anything all morning, give me a second. I'm gonna go grab my water. So yeah, looking at everything, all the video games and fighting games and character designs and everything like that that's out there. Um, and the state of which fighting games are these days. Oh, is this a deep dive into deep dive into the Matrix? It's so amazing how the Matrix movie. Sorry, I got a YouTube playlist. Just I set those on, and of course I'm putting on videos that I find interesting. Huh. Yeah, Film Comics Explained. I thought he was associated with Comics Explained a long time ago when I started watching them, but apparently not. He's just his own dude with a creepily similar name. But he breaks down like films and comics, obviously. And he makes these really good videos, so yeah, he's talking about Matrix, so I popped that one on. That's what's playing in the background right now. So I might listen for a second, just because the Matrix is so good. But yeah, I'll pick up what I was talking about with fighting games and characters and designs and things like that. Red pill, blue pill.
That is the Matrix.
I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting it will do.
Neo swallows the red pill, which acts as a tracer, allowing Morpheus and his crew to locate Neo's body and make the battery comes in the real world. In the gruesome moment of birth, Neo is released from the simulation and sees the world as it truly is, before being picked up by Morpheus and his crew.
Welcome to the real world. Far from it.
After being swept up into Nebuchadnezzar, Neo's mind is enhanced by computer programs teaching him how to fight and embrace and he can bend the Matrix's programming rules. And as he trains, Morpheus explains the world to him. Everything from the Matrix being a simulation, machines harnessing humans to the point that there's only one human stronghold left called Zion, to the prophecy that he is the one.
Damn.
You are a slave, Neo. Like every match, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison forever.
While its theme may initially be brain-melting, the Matrix's presentation of the simulation hypothesis is quite simple. Humans are physically plugged into a mainframe, which runs a simulation in their minds, and when they're unplugged, they return to the real world. In other words, the divide between simulation and reality is eminently clear within the narrative of the film. Thus, in this binary sense of reality versus simulation, the Matrix points to the foundational ideal of Plato's cave. In his work Republic, this allegory presented by Plato
See,
centers
this
on
is
the
why I be
idea
listening to it.
of
Now
a
he's
chamber.
breaking down into
Humans
Plato, and
see one wall. On that wall, they see shadows of objects that pass
I was
by.
about to say he's just
Humans
breaking down the
cannot
movie right
understand
now.
what reality is. Only after they
I've
step
seen the
into the
movie.
cave and get to see the real world can they understand that reality is not what they once thought. Plato's cave is fundamental to the Matrix's version of the simulation hypothesis, as it works in binary. The shadows on a wall aren't reality. In 3D reality, the symbol to have a matrix is an image of a false reality, while the world of 2199 is real. The
Hmm.
allegory of the cave goes a step deeper. As a thought experiment, it questions if we can ever know that what we're looking at is reality. This directly ties in with one of the film's key influences, French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, particularly his 1981 paper, Simulacra and Simulation, which was mandatory reading for everyone involved in the production of The Matrix. Early in the movie, we see Jean's book, Simulacra and Simulation, on screen, which dives into a version of the simulation hypothesis in postmodernism. The phrase the desert of the real, which Morpheus uses to describe the wasteland of the real world, also comes from Baudrillard. The philosopher was even asked to work on the later Matrix films, but declined the offer, for a reason we'll get onto in a minute. Baudrillard's simulation hypothesis is far more complex than Plato's cave. Instead of Platonic binaries, Baudrillard argues that the line between simulation and reality is one that is relatively unknowable, as if one reality is false, what is there stopping the next reality from also being simulation? Jean noted, simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyper-real. We can see this argument in full force through two
Huh.
scenes. When Cypher is talking with Agent Smith, he eats a steak, acknowledging that both the steak and his experience of it are false, exclaiming that without that knowledge, he could just enjoy it. Interestingly, Mouse makes a remarkably similar statement in the real world, arguing that but if we look at these statements, they're essentially the same. They both discuss getting into human pleasures, but these human pleasures can as easily be created by a machine revealing Neo's true
He's
power
beginning to
inside the
believe.
Matrix as a complete construct, allowing him to transcend the division between both realities and break the rules of the Matrix in spectacular fashion. Not only does he effectively break the will of the most powerful programs within the Matrix, but he also seemingly destroys Agent Smith and comes out on the other end realizing his true potential by fulfilling the prophecy of the One, raising questions about determinism and free will. Within the Matrix's narrative and interpretation of the simulation hypothesis is a
How
recurrent
long is
question
this
of free
video?
will. At the
I
very
don't want.
beginning of the film, Neo receives a message on his computer reading knock knock. Just before a knock comes at the door, the Oracle correctly predicts that Neo will knock over a vase,
Hmm.
and the glaring determinist prophecy that Neo is the One all point firmly towards our characters lacking any free will. But at the same time, Neo adamantly refutes the idea of fate, exclaiming,
I don't like the idea that I'll not be controlling my life.
while the Oracle also explains that Neo isn't the One, when, well, he is. This divide between determinism and free will is one which spans the entire franchise, with the later films discussing how societal human structures enact their own type of determinism. In one notable conversation, Neo talked to Counselor Army about how the machines which control Zion's air and water supplies are controlled by the humans, but because the fact that their failure or switching off would spell the death of all humanity, the humans are simultaneously controlled by the machines, spelling a codependent determinist loop.
Hmm.
I like to be reminded that cities survive because of the use of machines. Sometimes I think about all those people still talking to the Matrix and using these machines. I can't help thinking
See, that's something I never thought about.
I'll clock into mine.
In many ways,
And
the Matrix can be seen as the human inability to accept determinism.
is that still the
Neo,
first movie or is that the
contracted to
second one?
adapt to
It's
its
got to be the
environment,
second movie.
rejects the idea wholeheartedly. But throughout the
That there was
franchise,
machines still
Neo
keeping
stays steadfast
humanity
in his
alive
belief
in the
in the
second
knowledge,
movie.
the bars, and the fulfilling of the prophecy that he is, in fact, the One. In fact, in The Matrix Reloaded, it turns out that the
See,
prophecy
that's
of Neo
interesting.
being the One is one which has played out 5 times in the past, each time being projected predictable results of the Matrix itself. What makes this wild for me is that Baudrillard literally said, "The Matrix is surely the kind of film about the Matrix that the Matrix would have been able to produce." And in the grand scheme of the film franchise, he was right. But beyond an answer to whether determinism is true or not, the real intrigue of the film's determinism is posited by the Oracle herself. After Neo breaks the vase, as foretold, she poses the question of whether Neo would have still broken the vase if she hadn't foretold the event. Again, we can use this as a point to extrapolate. Neo was told by the Oracle that he wasn't the One, but then he became the One. So if the Oracle had acted differently, would he still have become the One? With questions like this, the Matrix ties itself to determinist ambivalence, begging us to ask ourselves these questions about simulation, reality, determinism, and free will. And while it simulates these arguments in a sci-fi setting, it never reaches out into our real world to suggest that we are living in a simulation or not. But this very thought brings us right back to Baudrillard and the question of how we could ever know. How could we know if this was a simulation without waking up? How could we know whether our actions are predetermined or done through free will? While modern philosophy, science, and culture all struggle with these seemingly unanswerable questions, we can turn them back onto ourselves, asking simply, does any of it matter? If we were ripped from the Matrix today, as Baudrillard suggests, how would we be able to know whether the so-called reality we emerged into wasn't simply another simulation? As we tumble down this and the many questions that follow, we're left with the incredible nihilism which pushes us back towards by far the film's most hated character, Cypher.
I know this fate doesn't exist. I know that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that it is juicy and delicious. After 9 years, you know what I realized? Ignorance is bliss.
Despite the fact that Cypher says that ignorance is bliss for different reasons, perhaps he was onto something, as if the only thing we know is that we cannot know. Perhaps it's better not to know.
All right. Okay. Turn the volume back down. Sorry about that, man. You know, I be listening to some like obviously I watch things that interest me. So the only problem with listening to those things while I work on this stuff, and if I find myself on a rant, like I was talking about a subject matter that I wanted to discuss that pertains to the actual stream that I'm working on, it's like I start getting introduced to ideas. Like, for instance, I'm thinking about the Matrix now, even though I was just talking about fighters and things like that. But I guess it was in lieu of things that inspire me and what I'm working on and things like that. And absolutely, Matrix has inspired me. And the Matrix series follows this whole, it's like Terminator, where it's like rise of the machines and machines taking over and things like that. Except it's less action, more thought, even though there is action, of course. And I have something similar in in my story, at least, just because it takes place like when I started writing the story and you include everything that you wanted in there. Like, I have everything that I've always wanted to write about and work on and projects like that, and then I had to just go and write my own. And yeah, I'd be lying if I said like robots and things like that didn't matter. Even this character here that I'm working on, super, he's superhuman. No, he's not a superhuman. He's a regular human. He's a human. Um, but the story that he comes up in, which isn't until later on into the story, like by the time I'm in that story, so much science fiction stuff would have happened in the world that this guy lives in a world where there are machines and there are like potential robot takeovers and things like that. Um, that's why it took so many years to put this story together, because there's just there's so much that I wanted to work on, so much that I wanted to tell, so much perspective that I wanted to give. And again, once I started writing, it became about my thoughts on these things. Hence the reason why I have thoughts about fighting game character design and things like that, because fighting game characters also play a major role in the inspiration behind what I'm working on here. Oh yeah, now I'm watching a Comics Explained video. But yeah, to exit from the thoughts about the Matrix for a second and to get back to the fighter conversation I was having. Um, what was I talking about? That there's only so many like geese and things like that that you can like design. Think about like Ryu's design. Think about like the main character of all video games, or of all fighters, especially if they're like a traditional fighter, kind of like like Ryu, or what's his name on Tekken? Kazuma. Is it Kazuma or Kazuya? I forget. But you look at him and his clothes and things like that. It's like, okay, they threw flame on the pants, but still the pants are very similar to those of Ryu's. Okay, his his gloves that he wears have like metal studs in them, but they're still just these kind of like MMA gloves. These what are they, like 10-ounce gloves or whatever, like these light gloves. That are still similar to like Ryu's and things like that. Like, and that's what I mean when I say there's only so many before it's like, okay. That's why when I started, or let me jump forward now, because those are old games, and yeah, that's where the gaming started. And they've continued to make fighting games, and other fighting games have come out, and then you have to design characters for those games, and it's like, uh, I would say, what makes those games somewhat appealing and interesting are the character designs, because they're branching out. The character design has branched out, and when you branch out and you create these other um, create these new characters, and you're like, okay, we can't do, or not that you can't do, but we don't want to do your typical traditional fighter. We don't want the gi with the gloves. Like we've seen. That's what made Mortal Kombat appealing to me, because even though it was one of those early fighters, they kind of made the stuff up. I guess you can call it like, oh, they were ninja suits. And, ninja suits are something similar. But I would say Mortal Kombat early on was like one of the more less traditional fighters, and more when it comes to character design. They found their own lane. Like I said, I guess they focus more on like ninja stuff for their characters, rather than like fighters and gis and stuff like that. But their ninja aesthetic became the fighting gi in their fighter world, and then you see it rinse and repeat on Sub-Zero and Scorpion. But then they create Rain, Smoke, Reptile, and then even when they got into the girls, you have Melina and Katana, and yeah, they're sisters. They're supposedly like twin sisters of some sort. Whatever their story is, they're very similar. Even their designs became like a rinse and repeat of one another's. They were just color palette swaps, and that's still early on. So yeah, when games began to evolve and they started creating more fighter games, uh, you know, in order to differentiate yourself from just the everyday uh, generic ninja suit, generic uh, gi fighter, you know, they began to design these characters. Oh, even like Virtua Fighter, like that guy's the main fighter in there. He has a white gi, like he looks like Kazuya in Ryu's clothing. You see what I mean when it comes to fighters, like Virtual Fighter came in later because of the 3D aspect of it. I remember I used to have the handheld Virtual Fighter uh, game. It wasn't even a Game Boy. It was literally Virtual Fighter on a handheld device. It had its own hardware that you had to buy to play. But I remember having that. But even that main character, he like I said, he's Kazuya in Ryu's uh, uniform, basically. And that's what I mean by like there's only so many designs before it's like, okay, we kind of tapped into all the designs. What are we gonna palette swap it to death? You know what I mean? Even that was happening, especially when they started like as a selling point, uh, offering more color options. You know what I mean? Where it wasn't just like two color options like it was in the beginning, but it started to become about like, you have four color options now. Now you have 20. Like there's so many color options, but it's just palette swapping. So yeah, it's not necessarily like really creation. So when these new fighter games came out, they had to create their own stuff. Think about Guilty Gear, think about Skullgirls, think about I mean, all the unnamed ones that weren't that successful, but even things like Power Stone, that's something like a fighter, but not really. It's not like a 2D back and forth fighter. It's more of like a 3D thing. But uh, even later iterations of Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, as they uh, built up their roster, they would have their character designs would get a little bit more involved. Look at I don't know who's a new one in Street Fighter, like Nikali or Manette, like, and try to imagine those fighters in an 8-bit world or a 64-bit world or 32-bit, whatever it was when like the SNES was out. How deep are we in? We're not even an hour in. Cool. There we go. So now, as the games evolve, you can see how like the character designs kind of had to evolve. And then gaming itself evolved. Like we had like the wrestling games and things like that. I remember like whatever like those WWE games, WWF games for like the Nintendo 64 came out. Um, Things like that. And then like UFC was becoming a thing. I remember playing a video game on the Dreamcast with Tito Ortiz and this is before the Ultimate Fighter, so this is before like the UFC really blew up, when it was still like very obscure and people didn't know about it. And Tito Ortiz was like a huge star because it's like, yo, who's this badass looking dude with this Cisco bleach blonde uh, short haircut looking like Cisco and shit. Like I remember playing that on the Dreamcast and just being like, what the hell is this? And then you had, boxing games like on the Dreamcast, like what was that? What was the fun one that had Chris Rock voicing the guy? Chris Rock voiced a character in a boxing game. Ready to Rumble. That's such a good game. And like that's a game that needs to come back. A really fun boxing game with these wild characters and character designs and things like that. Like that's a dope game. And yeah, you got to think about like how many designs do you have, can you go through before you have to start like either going off the deep end or um before you start going off the deep end or just like reinventing the wheel one way or another. Like reused design hasn't really changed, and now you have these 3D swap, or now that it's all in 3D and stuff like that. Like you get versions of him. Like I think there's like a suit with him looking like a chef and all these things, and it's like, okay, cool. Now we're branching out. Um, which that's dope, you know. But that's the state of games now, where I'm working on this character, and he's your basic. I mean, if I had to like name it and try to give some sort of comparison, yeah, he's your basic Shoto fighter. Oh, I got a Maximilian Dude video now. Which one is this? Oh, he's talking about Arc System Works wanted to do rollback netcode. on all their games. Mm. So you're saying that it's gonna be more for like Blaze Blue, not so much like Dragon Ball Fighters or something, because of like ownership rights and all that stuff. Makes sense. Yeah, so if it were to happen for like Dragon Ball Z or Dragon Ball Fighters, yeah, Bandai would have to. Okay. This is why I like listening to Max, man. He'll break down like the business side of things a lot. All right, so going back to my rambling about character designs, now this isn't for a video game. This is me just working, doing production work for animations, and leading into the production. It's all detailed on my Patreon page, G Mr. Drew on Patreon. Check it out. Um, that I'm basically just making my own production, and I'm going down the line, and all this is concept art. That's why this is labeled like character concept art, because this is just concept art that, and it's not to be confused with character design. Character design and character concept art are two completely different things. You're exercising different muscles, you're aiming towards different end goals, um, things like that. Yeah, might as well just do that. So yeah, it's like, what's the difference? Char- Concept design is literally just trying to get the idea out. I have an idea of a character, just like I have an idea of this character, and I just want to get the ideas of this character out because I want to be able to flesh him out more, but without really understanding him, his role, what he's going to look like without knowing little details like this. It's just the next step in the process of like, okay, I have an idea in my head, now I need to get it down on paper. I did all these sketches a couple years ago of all these characters, but they're all mostly just pencil sketches. And that wasn't necessarily concept design. That was just me seeing, because after I wrote the story and realized I had 400 characters, it was like I needed to test myself to see if I could even draw 400 characters. And I learned a lot. And yes, I can. So it's like I learned a lot um, about having to differentiate characters, how to create unique characters, things like that. Just you learn a lot in a process like that. And oh man, I think the neighbors or the people that were renting upstairs are leaving or moving out. They're not moving out, but I guess their vacation's over. They're going back home. Yeah, I've already watched this video because I watch Max live on Twitch, so I've already seen this. I was just wondering if I had seen it or not. There we go. And yeah, that's why, this guy is the first character that I'm working on. Like I said, if he's like your atypical Shoto type character, and he's kind of like a Sub-Zero, a Scorpion, a Ken, a Ryu type of character, and he's kind of on the outskirts. Like obviously my main character and other characters more associated with the main character may also have something similar going on like this character does, and things like that. Um, I had to learn to differentiate them. That's why when I started the stream, I'm like, man, I love working on this character because he's kind of like in colder temperatures. His financial status and his location in the world and who he is and his family, it all separates him from the other typical Shoto type characters. And it's like, okay, cool. So now and that was all established during the writing process of working on this and trying to get this character in and how he fits in. And then it also establishes how he's different from the other ones. It's a concept. And if you look at my thumbnail sketches in my sketchbook years ago of this character, they are trash. They are trash. It was like I said, I was like, can I draw 400 characters? It got rough after a while, and I was like, you know what? I like this character too much. He plays too much of a role to like get rid of because he represents something story wise. So it's like I need to have him in here, even though those sketches that I made of him are trash. I'll figure it out when I get to the concept design stage. Like I have his role of who he is written into the story. Um, and it's dope, but it's also now like that's why I'm doing this concept art now. It's because I had some trash ass thumbnails, but I need this character and I need him to work in this way, that way, and he represents all these sort of different things story wise, but within the world and just him as a character. Like that's why I'm going through all these steps. That's why production goes through all these steps. I just happen to be one guy, but when you're working with a whole team, like yeah, they do the same exact things, except they may be doing it simultaneously. Obviously, you need your writers to be working before your concept designers to be working before your character designers. There's a process, and step one, two, threes, A, B, C, whatever way you want to look at it. Like all of that exists for a reason, and that's what I do here. Oh wait, was he talking about? There we go, clean that up. go. All right, sorry, I was just listening to what he's saying because he was like, "Oh, people are lying" or something like that. But yeah, I guess yeah, he's still just talking about rollback netcode. Um, so yeah, because I'm just one guy who's doing all of this production, like yeah, it's gonna take a long time, but this is the lifelong process. This is what we all want to achieve as artists, I would imagine. Like yeah, your dreams start small, and depending on where you're at in your artist life or artist career, whatever you want to do it, if you started working professionally or not, um, every artist has dreams and goals, and that's what's so cool about being an artist and meeting other artists is like, hey, who are you? What can you do? Where would you like to go and be and end up? And obviously, we all would like to work for top tier companies and things like that. I would love to. Um, I come on here and I often talk about how, I just can't get a job in with those companies. And instead of being angry and frustrated and cursing life and anything like that, I would much rather just just go out on my own and say, hey, you know what? Um, maybe it's just not meant for me now, and uh, what I need to do. Okay. There we go. But yeah, like I've learned all this stuff, and because I can't work on it with them, and not to be bitter or anything, but it's like all right, I'll do it myself. I'll do it myself. Do I think that's the best way to go about? No. But is also after a decade of getting turned down by companies and continuing that also the best way to be like, yo, let me get into this industry or let me work for your company. Let me, you know, I mean, all of it is a business transaction. It's like I have all these skills and this understanding and I would like to apply it towards your business and your company. And obviously in return all I get is paid living, the ability to pay for a living and things like that, and something of a portfolio. uh, and portfolios vary because depending on the company and depending on the time, things like that, you may not even be able to expose your portfolio, because let's say you did concept work for a game and that game doesn't release for 2 years. You can't release that work until the game comes out, and that's at best. It's not until the game comes out that uh, or the movie comes out that you can say, hey, I did these pieces. I did them 3 years ago. This is some 3-year old work, but this is the first time the world is seeing it. What am I watching here? I don't even know who this is. Final Fantasy VIII analysis. Okay, so these are some Final Fantasy guys. Story of the Arc podcast? State of the Arc podcast. You know what? I've never watched this before. I'm gonna listen because this is about Final Fantasy VIII, which has always interested me. Because
along the way. So I will pop in every.
let me pause this. So I'm not talking over them. Final Fantasy VIII analysis, episode 1, State of the Arc podcast. It just popped up on my stream. I mean, I know I watch a lot of Final Fantasy stuff. Um, I'm not familiar with these guys. Resonant Arc, published March 15th, 2021. So it's fairly recent. And yeah, I'm super into Final Fantasy games. I was a kid when Final Fantasy 7 came out. I couldn't afford a PlayStation, so I never played it. I shouldn't say I never played it, but I didn't play it. Um, and but I had friends with PlayStations, and I would watch them play. And by the time I was watching them play, uh, um, they had released Final Fantasy 8. So I kind of like learned about Final Fantasy 7 and Final Fantasy 8 almost simultaneously. Like obviously I watched 7 first, but when you're a kid and when I'm looking back 20 years, like the time that I was learning about them was damn near simultaneous. I was watching one friend play Final Fantasy 7 while watching another one play Final Fantasy 8. And yeah, I, I know, obviously we know at this point like Final Fantasy 7 is the GOAT, while Final Fantasy 8 is good, but like people don't talk about it as much for whatever reason. And it's always interested me because I was like, man, I was a kid. That game was cool. Like it was as cool as Final Fantasy 7 is to me. Maybe I'm, because I was a kid, I wasn't like looking into the story beats and all that other stuff. And I was just sitting there looking at the visuals of like, hey, you got Sword Man and Gun Man and dragons and monsters and they're fighting and it's all cool. So maybe that's just how I remember it in my head. Is like, yeah, it's all cool. So I'm always interested in Final Fantasy VIII videos because I want more insight into like why it didn't pan out for 8 like it did for 7. Because when 6 came out, I was too young to really know about any of these games. When 6 came out, I was playing like Super Mario and I didn't have Sonic or I didn't have Sega, so I couldn't play Sonic. But friends had it, so I would watch them play Sonic. Like it was during those days, and Final Fantasy would have been like way too advanced for a kid like me and my older brother. Like, so we never messed with that. So Final Fantasy 7 would have been our introduction to the Final Fantasy world. And you got to remember we're talking 90s, so like internet didn't exist and like availability and all that other stuff. Like the world was what it was back then. But I'm always interested in Final Fantasy 8 because it's like I'm looking for that thing to tell that just flat out tells me like what's going on. So I watch a bunch of videos of it, and they're far and few between. Uh, so yeah, I might shut up because I've been talking about some character stuff, but I may have made my point. Let me hit the bathroom, drink some water. What time is it? It's time for me to brew some coffee. So yeah, I'm gonna drink water, hit the bathroom, brew coffee. I'm gonna do all that. So give me a few minutes. Okay, give it 15 minutes for the coffee to brew. I got my water, got everything. And before I be quiet and listen to this potentially really cool show, Resident Arc or YouTube channel, and maybe end up like subscribing and listening to more of their stuff in the future. I always love finding new channels that always have like something dope going on because it's like, oh my god, so much more content for me to like absorb and things like that. Like it's always about learning, never stop learning. But before I play this video, I wanted to just wrap up everything that I was saying with the character stuff. You know what I mean? I'm so cats in a bag uh, when I talk off the top of my head and I have these distractions in the background, which may be a problem, maybe a charm to what I'm doing here. Uh, but just to wrap up everything that I've been saying and to get to the point is, you know, it might be when it comes to doing all this concept design, character design, and all these things, 400 characters is a lot, and you're gonna have some that overlap and are related to one another, and it becomes important to uh, it's important to be able to establish the differences in them just visually. And this guy, fortunately, has enough going on for him independently from the other characters that I'm not having too much trouble establishing establishing him. But also because he's the first one that I'm working on out of the group, out of the lot, um, I'm having a lot of fun with the designs because it's just me uh, working on the designs for all of them, if that makes sense. Like, they're all going to be more or less like this, but they're going to be older, maybe. They're going to be, with less resources, maybe, less financials, maybe, or more this, less that. You know what I mean? And then you have to be able to translate that over. Now, I know I draw this guy with no shoes, but he has all this other clothes, and it's like, well, no, he can afford shoes. He just prefers not to. That's going to be one of like his things, and he has kind of like these hand feet, and that was something I just decided on the fly. But I'll never forget that, especially since I put so much emphasis on this funky shaped foot, where it's like, oh, okay, his feet are like hands, and they make sense because of everything that I'm doing here. And even a little thing like that is going to separate him in his move set, in how he moves, and how he does things, just physically. You know what I mean? Out of all the, that's just one identifying feature, and it's things like that that are gonna like carry things over. But I get to do a wide variety of things for this guy. One, because he's younger, he's cooler, he has a little more hip hop edge to him and things like that. But he also has like the standard traditional fighter stuff going on, and I've had to do this with not just this character type. There's like magic, there are monsters. You see me work on all monsters. That's why I'm working on this human character for finally, for finally, and and yeah, uh, so I think I'll just end it there. I always ramble, and I just want to listen to this video, man. Let's let's have me stop talking, and hopefully this doesn't get me in trouble on YouTube when
Please
this
enjoy
goes up.
this long-form analysis of Final Fantasy VIII.
Long form analysis of Final Fantasy VIII by State of the Arc. Channel is called Resident Arc on
All right,
YouTube.
everyone get some popcorn, because this is going to be a little bit of a story here. Interject with any questions that you might have along the way, or anything that you're interested in adding to. All right, so as everybody probably knows who watches this channel, or maybe if you're a new viewer who just discovered us recently and maybe you don't know a lot about the history of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy was created by Hironobu Sakaguchi. He was a lead developer back in the 1980s at Squaresoft when it was kind of just a startup. And he worked with a couple of key developers. I think there were 7 total to create Final Fantasy. And that boosted the company into superstardom. And he led each Final Fantasy game as the director, that was his title, up through Final Fantasy V, right? Then, on Final Fantasy VI, his official title was producer. Final Fantasy VII, his official title was producer. Final Fantasy VIII, his title became executive producer. Now, there are some parallels here between Kaysen and I come from a filmmaking background. Do you want to talk about the difference between the director, the producer, and the executive producer, what those mean?
Yeah,
I'm
so
already
the
loving this.
director has the hands-on creative control over basically everything. The producer is essentially the director's like boss in a lot of ways. I mean, it depends on how hands-on the producer wants to be. But the producer has also a very hands-on approach to managing the team, managing the budget, managing how everything's going. The executive producer does very little for the game. The executive producer is basically just the executive who's in charge of the company and just receives reports and meetings and stuff. Executive producing a game typically means that you're just one of the higher ups in the company and you didn't actually do very much hands-on work on the actual game itself or the movie, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So a lot of times executive producer is just like a formal title. Like whoever the CEO of the company is, they're the executive producer. Or whoever, the executive that headed up or, budgeted the thing, they're just the producer. And they don't actually do anything creatively.
Yeah. One of the film classes I took, I really liked the way the professor put it. He said, usually the director is like the artistic boss of the project. The producer is the business boss of the project. The executive producer is the guy who gives the okay for the money to be spent. It's just like, here you go.
So he had one job. He signs a piece of paper one time.
Yeah. Here you go, producer, who's going to do all the work.
Then there's a problem.
Here, executive producer says, here you go, producer. You are approved to spend the money. The producer then puts the team together. The producer essentially creates the team who will make the game. Yeah. And the director then generally leads that team on the artistic decisions. Now, as Kaysen said, though, producers can and often do actually get more hands-on in the creative process. This actually is not very uncommon, and in Hironobu Sakaguchi's case, he was very much still in the trenches, doing programming work, writing stories, and leading the team. There was a comment a couple podcasts ago where somebody was trying to make the case that Sakaguchi's role on Final Fantasy has been greatly exaggerated post the NES title. So after Final Fantasy III, he actually wasn't involved. And this actually just is, it's simply not true. And I have some good quotes here that I want to read from Kitase to talk about just how involved Sakaguchi was in creating the stories and
Look at this, man. They deep diving hard, man.
especially the mechanic side on Final
I
Fantasy
love
VII.
this shit.
This quote is coming from Kitase, and it's from a Famitsu interview, and he's talking about Final Fantasy VII. He says, at the time, there were a lot of Western fantasy RPGs around, so we wanted to set it apart, and we wanted to achieve more realistic ways of showing the story. Also, Mr. Sakaguchi had suggested a modern drama-esque story with a strong sci-fi feel. Mr. Sakaguchi had been deeply involved with the story up to Final Fantasy VI, but with FF7, he focused his efforts on the battles. It was Mr. Sakaguchi who suggested the materia system. Okay? So, now this is a quote from Sakaguchi about Final Fantasy VII. He says, in terms of the premise, it was something that we had been holding on to for some time. I had imagined the world years before and its core themes about the way we treat the Earth, and the idea that when we die, we turn its energy, or we turn into energy and are assimilated into the Earth and reborn somewhere else. So, while he wasn't as involved with like the event scene creation, like writing the actual words on the paper and programming the scene itself, as he had been on every Final Fantasy before,
He hadn't been
he
doing
still
scripting.
suggested the setting. He still suggested the theme of the game.
He was doing writing, not scripting,
Things talking about the way we treat
more or
the
less.
Earth, these things about life and death. There are other
Which,
quotes that I've talked about.
writing comes before the
He's still very much
scripting.
involved in sort of like the core identity of what Final Fantasy VII was about. But he left the actual like writing, scene direction, all of that to Kitase. So Kitase was the director of that project, but Sakaguchi was still a very involved producer. And he was especially on Final Fantasy VII involved in the tech side of it. So getting Square up to speed on how to create games in 3D became like his primary job. It's
Okay.
like nobody here knows anything.
See, they started with 7, then went to 8.
This is the future of the freaking industry. We have no idea.
That guy had a hell of a
So he was
task.
very much involved in going to tons of seminars. In fact, when he met with Yuji Horii, and they came up with the idea to do Chrono Trigger, they were flying to like a workshop or a seminar in the United States to learn about 3D graphics. Like that's what they were doing, was trying to figure out how are we gonna freaking like make games in 3D. And that's where they met, or where they met and they decided to make Chrono Trigger together. So here's another quote from Kitase about Final Fantasy VI. With FF6, my role is similar to what it had been with FF5, except that the volume of the game grew once again exponentially. So the team of people working on the event scenes and scenario side grew to about 4 or 5. And of course, Sakaguchi was the director and had primary control, overseeing those aspects of the game as well. But he'd also become very busy at that time after becoming vice president of the company and had a lot of other projects going on. He couldn't put 100% into Final Fantasy VI, so I took charge of more of those event scenes. There's another quote here. I'm going to skip through this a little bit so we can get through it faster. When it came to starting work on the 6th game, I wanted to approach the story with an ensemble cast, partly to do with something completely different, or to do something completely
The 6th
different
game,
for the
which is
audience. I first saw this
regarded as
storytelling
maybe
in
one of the
Star
best,
Wars,
or maybe
which is
it's up there with
Final
Final
I
Fantasy
wanted to try
7,
something similar with a fantasy story.
but it was still
Lots
a
of different
2D
characters.
graphic game
So the idea of an ensemble cast
before they went into
was
3D.
Sakaguchi's. And then he says he divided the responsibilities between us. This is Kitase talking. He placed me in charge of event production, carefully assessing those parts I directed. So Sakaguchi is still very much involved in the actual creation of the stories and in the creative process between on Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy V as well. There's a great quote here. I'm not going to read it because it's long, where he talks about the first scene in Final Fantasy V, the opening scene where you see, I think King Tycoon comes out and he like gets on the dragon and flies away, and Lena is like talking to him. You remember that scene, Case, in the opening of Final Fantasy V?
You know, it's been a while.
It's been a while.
No. So it essentially just starts off with like it pans down on the castle, and you see the king walk out. His wyvern is like sitting there, and he like gets on the wyvern to like right off to the wind shrine to like see why the wind has stopped blowing. Like the wind, something's happened to the wind crystal. And Lena comes running out and talking. She's worried. Anyways, that whole opening sequence, which is a pretty iconic sequence, it's really well directed, that was all done by Sakaguchi. And Sakaguchi and Kitase had this sort of like friendly rivalry between them, where Kitase would write or program an event, and then Sakaguchi would say, "Ooh, I can do better," and then he would make one, and they would try to like one up each other all the time, right, as they would go through the game. So the point of all of this is to say that Final Fantasy VIII was the first game in the series where Sakaguchi, the creator of the series, was not in creative control of the final product. And this is important. This is important to understand. Here's a couple of quotes from Sakaguchi himself. He says, "I wasn't directly involved with Final Fantasy VIII. I left it to another team to develop and let them do whatever they wanted with it and take it in their own direction. Then another quote from him. Most of these quotes are coming from Edge magazine. I've got it was the 30th anniversary of Final Fantasy edition, where they had just tons, like a whole like retrospective on the whole series. This is a really good issue. But most of the quotes that I'm reading now are coming from this. But here's a good one from Sakaguchi. To be honest, when I heard their idea to write the game like a high school drama, I was concerned. But having told them they could go ahead in their own direction, I couldn't very well take it back. And then he says, because of the approach that they took with that game, I pulled the rudder hard back the other way with Final Fantasy IX. I wanted to go right back to the beginning of the series with a traditional fantasy story, knights, castles, and so on. I figured that would calibrate and restabilize the series somehow. Okay, so I know that this is
Talking about 9 now.
Introduction.
The cattail boy.
I promise that it has a lot to do with it. Because the creator of the series, for the first time, he had been sort of weaning Kitase up to this point. He'd been like working with him, and he was essentially handing the reins to Yoshinori Kitase to lead Final Fantasy, especially with Final Fantasy VIII. Sakaguchi had no part of this. And what happened was that he wasn't very, I don't want to say he wasn't happy, he did not agree with a lot of the choices that were made by Kitase. And he felt that the series needed to be calibrated or restabilized. There was a lot of debating going on during the creation of Final Fantasy VI and VII. The core team, a lot of them were getting.
Wow, that's interesting. So basically, just to kind of wrap up what he's saying here, and I don't want to say wrap up, I'll continue playing it soon because, yeah, it's super interesting. But I don't know how legal or illegal it is what I'm doing, and if I just post it and let them talk the entire time without me, like, at least providing some commentary, at least wherever I can. So yeah, Final Fantasy was always like this kind of knights and Middle Earth type of setting with, you know, dragoons and dragons and everything like that. Final Fantasy, what's the newest one that's going to be coming out? 16? Seems to be going back into that direction. But all the way up to Final Fantasy VI, it was always like that, and hence the name Final Fantasy. It was set in a fantastic world, you know, something like Hyrule or Zelda or all that other stuff, you know, that old school kind of dragons and knights and armor and things like that sort of stuff, with ghosts and goblins and all that sort of stuff. Like, that's what they were always set as. And then Final Fantasy VII, what he's talking about when he was like, give them the reins, let them go their own direction. Final Fantasy VII was the first time that they stepped out of that. And Final Fantasy VII, obviously, everyone knows that one. It's like a lot of steampunk and a lot of that. So I'm guessing what he's saying now is like, you know, he saw that they were going in the steampunk direction in Final Fantasy VII, but it was a huge, cool, you know, like it was successful. So it was like, all right, not gonna have too many problems with that. And then Final Fantasy VIII came out, and like I was saying, it was like very, very much like the same, around the same time. Like, I don't know how many years passed in between the two, but it wasn't long. If I was learning about them kind of simultaneously, maybe just a couple years apart from each other, which is super fast, by the way, especially for the 90s and things like that. Excuse me. Talking and drinking and all that stuff, and got the burpees. So yeah, Final Fantasy VIII also went into a different direction, and honestly, I wouldn't even know what to call it, because it wasn't steampunk. It was very fantastical, but it wasn't so old school. It was a little futuristic. Like, these guys had gun swords, you know what I mean? Like, the main character and the bad guy in there, they had like these swords that you could sword fight with, but also had triggers that you can shoot with, which gave you, like, you know, melee and long distance abilities to fight with. but like you're dealing with some more advanced technology in Final Fantasy VIII than you did in Final Fantasy VII. And I'm guessing that's what he's talking about when he's saying like he wanted to take him back and get away from that, trying to get away from the steampunk stuff, trying to get away from that and bring it back to what Final Fantasy had been for 3/4 of the time. Because coming up on 8 and the first 6 being that old fantasy stuff, 75% of your product is uh, dragons and ghosts and goblins and shit like that. So yeah, to reel it back to that as opposed to like, hey, we're kind of going off the rails with the steampunk. That was cool, but now we're back to back with no dragoons and shit like that. Let's dial it back. And then Final Fantasy IX comes out. Final Fantasy IX, it did that. It's kind of like a fantasy setting, and you have this kind of cat guy, this boy with a cat's tail, but there's still like knights and armor and stuff like that going on, and princes and kings and wizards and shit like that. Taking it back to the fantasy element. Um, and I've only watched playthroughs of Nine. I never knew anybody who played it until I went to college, and a friend of mine told me about it. A college buddy of mine told me about it. So I don't know too much about Nine, but after watching a playthrough and looking at the story and everything like that, like just like any other game and everything else out there, had its ups and downs. But yeah, that's another one that's regarded highly. Uh, so I don't know what the ranking would be, but if 7 is the best and 6 is like second best, 9 is up there, and it might be third best. So yeah, they were knocking them out of the park at this time. But yeah, let me let these guys continue breaking it down more intelligently than me.
Final Fantasy games. They kind of wanted to do their own things. They had different ideas about how the series should be handled, how it should be done in the future. There were a lot of disagreements happening behind the scenes. And when and Sakaguchi was concerned about that because he didn't want people to feel like, all I can do in this company is make Final Fantasy. That's all this company is. Like, it doesn't give me the freedom to do anything else. I can't like expand my own, creative ideas. And he was concerned about that. He talks about that in an Iwata Asks interview. I really struggled with that. And so this was was one step to trying to allow some of his junior developers under him to sort of like do what they wanted to do
That's awesome.
with Final Fantasy. And he didn't necessarily agree with a lot of their choices. So let's talk about.
Hey, do what you do, but I might stop you.
Director, as we said, was Yoshinori Kitase. He
Age-old
came
tale.
into Square during the development of FF4, but didn't work on that game. He became an event director or a cutscene director on Final Fantasy V, and then was the director on Final Fantasy VI and VII, and now 8. But as we said, this was the first time he was given total creative control, and he could do whatever he wanted. Shinji Hashimoto was the producer of Final Fantasy VIII. We actually saw him. Our first when we went to E3 in 2017. We walked in, literally opened the doors open. We walked in, we turned around, and Shinji Hashimoto just walked right past me into the Square Enix section of the floor. I was like, "Holy crap, that's Shinji Hashimoto!"
And that was when I think Kingdom Hearts 2.8 came out or something like that. And
Yeah.
he was producing that at the time.
Okay, so we have Ken Narita as a lead programmer. He had been around since the Famicom days, but had also been on Final Fantasy VII in particular. Hiroyuki Ito, battle system designer. We know him as the creator of the ATB system and a co-director on FF6. Yusuke Naoda as the art director. He was also the art director on FF7. Kazushige Nojima as the scenario writer. He was the Final Fantasy VII scenario writer as well. Tetsuya Nomura as the character designer again, with illustrations provided by Yoshitaka Amano. Amano had been around since the beginning. Tetsuya Nomura had been around since Final Fantasy IV, but on 4 he was more of like a debug. He was on the debugging team. But FF5 was the first time he had a chance to like really do art on a game. So he did all the monster designs on Final Fantasy V. He created a couple of episodes and did backstories in Final Fantasy VI, and then was the main character designer for Final Fantasy VII.
7, he has said in the past that Final Fantasy 8 is his actual, like where he was free to do his actual style, the way that he, envisions the art. So for Final Fantasy 7, he was the character designer, but he, there was a lot of oversight from other people telling him how the character should look, and then he would design them. For Final Fantasy 8, he had more creative control over designing the characters how he wanted to.
That's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because this is kind of going into, again, like understanding where these developers are coming from on FF8, right?
Yeah.
They were not necessarily really they weren't happy, totally happy, totally like satisfied creatively in their previous work on the Final Fantasy games.
Wow.
And here's a quote from Kitase underneath this. It was just a continuation over and over again. Within those letters and opinions we saw, there were a number of people saying, isn't it time for something new? We like a new system. So rather than something we felt unsure or cautious about, we just really wanted to try something new and give it a go.
Mm.
And then in that, I think the PlayStation Japan interview that you're referencing, Kitase says that Nomura's work on FF7 wasn't really his style. And Nomura said, finally, on FF8, I could draw my own pictures like the ones before. So we see that within the junior development staff, many of whom worked on Final Fantasy VII and continued on the same team,
Check something.
on Final Fantasy VIII, there was still a strong desire to do things differently than they had in the past. To take things in their own direction, without the oversight of Hironobu Sakaguchi.
Okay. I don't want to break for too long, but I do have the Final Fantasy art books here, the Ultimania archives. I got 3 of them. I don't know if they're going to be making a 4th one for all the newer games, but they go from like all the way from 1 to 14. That's why I know a little bit about these, and I just wanted to see, since they're talking about this guy's artwork, I just wanted to crack open Final Fantasy VIII and see. Let me get to the right page. Yeah, see, so here's Amano's work. But what's this guy's name? Yorinobu or something like that? I want to see if we can find if they're, I don't know, it doesn't even look like they're putting credits on this artwork. I was hoping that maybe we could find some of the artwork that he's talking about. You know, like I don't know if he would have drawn all these things. The camera's so close. Full body rough sketch, like, yeah, like I don't know if these would be counted as his thing. They're not. No credits. What a bummer. But just so we could see the game, just in case any of you watching this video may not know. I was hoping that we'd see something like given credit so I can see this guy's work as I'm like kind of hearing about it right now. Man, I remember this game, but I don't. Like I really just remember the trio, Cypher being like the bad guy, the girl that they're always chasing, what's her name, like Luna or something like that, and then the main character, Squall. You can't forget a name like Squall. I remember the movie White Squall came out around the same time, I want to say, and that's when I learned what a squall was, and then I was like, wait, so you have a guy named Cloud and a guy named Squall, they're all just named after natural things? Yeah. Well, I guess can't find any of his credited work on there, but it was probably something with some of those things. I'm gonna continue playing it.
Hey guys, I will let you do it the way you want to. Okay? Now, this is to explain the divisiveness behind Final Fantasy VIII. The reason I believe that there is so much divisiveness is because there are many things, not not just things that people were used to seeing change in Final Fantasy, which is the story and the setting and the characters and the character progression system. These were things that changed basically every time. There was more to it. There was the approach to storytelling. There was art direction. There was many other things that were really really different from all the previous Final Fantasy games. And a lot of people could recognize that. And they said, what is going on here? This does not even feel like Final Fantasy.
Hell yeah.
What is this?
Bomber jackets and fur coats and shit.
Understanding why they did this, understanding the reasons why they did this, and being open to that fact, right? Like I was saying earlier, there's really a lot of great stuff. There's some really cool ideas in Final Fantasy. But if you went into it, and this is the problem I feel with like brands, like especially game companies. You see the Squaresoft logo, and you associate Final Fantasy again, a logo, right? A brand.
Yeah.
You associate it with that company. Say this company makes this great thing that I love, and you're not actually seeing the faces of the people who actually do the groundwork behind the scenes. There are people whose work you actually are drawn to, or that resonates with you,
Absolutely.
or that you prefer. Right?
Absolutely.
So
I think games have that more so than anything else, than movies or for sure books or any other type of entertainment medium. At least in movies, you're seeing actors, people. Whereas in games, nothing you see is it was all programmed basically. So I feel like games have that. You can separate the artist from the art a lot easier, just in your mind, than with anything like a movie or any other type of medium.
yeah, and especially with Japanese games too, a lot of these developers, they don't necessarily like being on camera necessarily, or
Right. Yeah. Sure.
they, a lot of times I really struggle in my videos to find like pictures that are larger than 160 by 160 images of these guys. They just don't have pictures of themselves on the internet that I can access to like show who this guy is.
Mhm.
There's a lot of people behind the scenes you don't see that have a pretty big effect on the final product. And even though this team was largely preserved from Final Fantasy VII and 6 and 5, there's a key piece missing from this. The creator of the series. And all of a sudden, they want to go in a vastly different direction from before. And so the game turns out really different. Now, we're not saying whether or not that was the right or wrong choice, or whether that was good or bad. What we're saying is that there are clear differences in style, and that those differences are purposeful.
Mm.
They were intentional on the parts of those making the game, because they wanted to do it differently from the way Sakaguchi had done it before.
Absolutely.
They were trying on purpose to break away from him and do it their own way and blaze their own trail.
Hell yeah, man.
Here's another great quote.
That's art. That's artist for you.
It says Final Fantasy VII was the turning point for the series. The visual style was based on the manga style, and then we decided to go for a more realistic approach.
Yep.
There was a huge amount of passionate debate, but in the end, I believe it was the right decision. It put the series on the track it's taken ever since. Without that switch, I think Final Fantasy XIV and 15 would have been very different games. After Final Fantasy VII came out, our rivalry with Dragon Quest changed. They didn't seem like rivals anymore. We were now focused on competing
Dragon
with
Quest.
Western games.
That's what Senpai was talking about with me last night.
Time in interviews on the previous FF game about how
Wow.
badly they
So it's
wanted
comparable to
to
Final Fantasy
they were
VII.
desperate to beat Dragon Quest.
Interesting.
And when they not only beat Dragon Quest, but smashed it into the dust with Final Fantasy VII sales, which blew
Smashed it into the
everything out of
dust.
water in terms of like JRPGs. And
Final Fantasy VII, man.
they
Can't play with it.
decided to go a different direction. They were no longer competing. Dragon Quest has a very the art style is kind of that Dragon Ball art style. It's
And it turned out to change.
Oh, that Dragon Quest. That's the red-haired protagonist.
as like the behemoth to take down, and now they didn't anymore. Now they wanted to compete with Western games, as he says.
For better or worse.
Yeah, Now here's another quote. This comes from the Edge magazine as well, from Kitase. When Sakaguchi first saw that demo at the school and a realistically proportioned human character, he said to me, that looks okay, but might you consider doing it with a more deformed character? He believed that that was what the series should look like. I considered what he said, but ended up sticking to my guns. I
Yeah.
wasn't involved.
That was something.
Yes.
Yeah, so just to break it down, Final Fantasy VII, you know, the original, when you play the game, you have your deformed character that you run around the world with, but then once you got into a battle, you had a different model that was a little more realistic, things like that. And, it was all just based upon what the PlayStation 1 was capable of outputting at that time. And yeah, I could only imagine, them talking about the deformed characters. It was just like, yeah, they had it both ways in they had it both ways in Final Fantasy VII. So coming into 8, yeah, he's suggesting to do the deformed character as well as the realistic one. But that was one thing about Final Fantasy VIII that always caught my attention, and I was like, why didn't this get more whatever? Like, I was too young at the time to really know about story or writing or characters or what made a good game or a bad game. When you're a young kid like I was probably 10, 11, maybe. I wouldn't even say I was 12. I it's probably like 10, honestly. What made a good game was, did you have fun? Did it look cool? Things like that. And like I said, I barely played them. I more watched along, so I was just watching them. And yeah, just as a viewer, those things are like movies, man. So yeah, it something else, man. It's something else. But yes, Final Fantasy VIII stood out because of the realism, because of how realistic all these characters looked. Um, it had like this realism approach that gaming was doing at the time. That was getting into with better graphics and things like that. So yeah, this is interesting that to learn about these companies and how they had, you know, the internal strife between it, because like I said, 8 is an enigma to me. Let me just continue playing.
And he goes on to say, I wasn't involved in FF9 because Sakaguchi had a new team that we'd established in Hawaii, and we're making it in parallel to Final Fantasy VIII. Part of the reason it looks the way that it does is because we had a big debate about the art style. The debate centered around whether we should keep the manga style, deformed characters of the 6th game, or aim for a more realistic approach and develop in that direction. Sakaguchi really wanted to do a classic-looking game on the new technology, which is where Final Fantasy IX came in. These are some very interesting quotes to try to break down. And there was a debate about what the future of Final Fantasy should be, how it should be done. There was a philosophical debate happening between the creator of the series and Kitase. And they made games back to back. The Kitase led Final Fantasy VIII, the Sakaguchi led Final Fantasy IX. Which game, not really much of a trivia question, outsold the other?
I think 9 outsold 8.
Well, I don't know, but I believe Final Fantasy VIII had more sales.
Final Fantasy VIII crushed Final Fantasy IX.
Really?
I think Final Fantasy VIII it didn't sell as many as 7, but it was up there in like the 8.5, 8.9 million.
I'm an idiot. Don't listen to me.
It's the 6th highest selling game of the PlayStation consoles in general.
Yeah. And so Final Fantasy IX sold about half as much.
You know what? That actually does make sense.
So now
I don't know why I guessed wrong. This is why I don't gamble.
The situation in the company right there at the turn of the century. Spirits Within, lots of pressure on the executives, Sakaguchi being vice president at the time.
Yep.
His direction,
Spirits Within.
his philosophy on what Final Fantasy should be sells half as well as Kitase's vision of what Final Fantasy should be. And now are we surprised when we see Final Fantasy 10 and 13 and 15 and this real focus on this ultra realism in Final Fantasy versus before where it was very much about chibi manga style, that kind of a mono surrealism in the concept art, but then being realized as these cute little characters. FF8 was the first step in taking Final Fantasy into this
realistic.
How they title it in Final, or how they word it in Final Fantasy 15? A fantasy based in reality.
Oh, that, yeah.
The entire concept of a fantasy based in reality started with Final Fantasy VIII. It was Nomura's intended, his preferred way of drawing characters.
Yep.
And it was the way that Kitase and his group thought that it would be more appealing to compete with Western games and go for that realism.
Wow.
And Sakaguchi's
He wasn't wrong.
about having the diorama style little deformed characters was eventually dismissed. And
So realism beat out
so,
chibi in America,
saying this,
essentially, is what they're
whether or
saying.
not it was the wrong or right choice. Everyone's going to have their own opinion on it. It doesn't matter what I think about whether that's the wrong choice or not. What matters is that there are clear differences in the approach and the philosophy behind how Final Fantasy VIII was made. There was an expectation based on 7 games beforehand, and this is the reason why there's probably some divisiveness on FF8. So let's talk a little bit about the story inspiration, and then we'll kind of move into our thoughts on the actual part of the game that we play. So we're wrapping up a little bit on the development history section here. He says there was a gear shift with the story in FF8. I think it was to do with the seriousness of the previous game's theme. I promoted that approach because we had this heavy, deep story with FF7 and Cloud's past and Aerith's death. I said, let's make things a little lighter and more cheerful now. Sorry, that was Kitase who said that one. This next one is from Mallory. Final Fantasy VII had a strong, dark atmosphere, and I got bored of that. The previous Final Fantasy games had images of light emerging from darkness. It was very beautiful.
Yeah.
But this time we wanted to turn it upside down. Shadows and light. That's how we made the atmosphere. In 7, most of the staff were new to CG, but this time we had to be ambitious because they were now used to it. The building with the gold halo reminds me of Costa del Sol or Golden Saucer. We will continue making interesting visuals. And then again, another quote here. Final Fantasy VII was quite visually dark, and it was also very serious, heavy story. From the very get-go, we wanted to make Final Fantasy VIII something much lighter in both visuals and tone. When we sat down to think about what would make a lighter and happier story, we thought about our school days as students. I don't know if everybody had a good time being a student. Maybe not everybody did. But when I sat down with Tetsuya Nomura-san, this is Kitase talking, to hash it out, we thought, actually, yeah, a story about kids in school would be a nice, cheerful story to go with. So that was the approach behind Final Fantasy VIII. After, especially 6 and 7 back to back, which are some really heavy, dark material. I mean, there's suicide in there. There's a lot of heavy stuff, right? Especially for games being made for the Super Nintendo, PlayStation, for kids to play for the most part.
Yeah.
They purposefully said, we want to step out of that a little bit and do something with a tone that's a little bit lighter, a little bit happier, not quite so heavy. And so that's why they chose the school setting for Final Fantasy VIII. And one more thing I wanted to mention before wrapping this up is that Kitase has done this a couple of times. He did it on what I read here and I wrote down. I'll get to in a second. For Final Fantasy VIII, he did this, but he also did this during Final Fantasy XIII's production. And that was that he essentially asked his team to think about what is Final Fantasy, which is a question we've been talking about on this channel basically this entire year. What is the spirit of Final Fantasy? A lot of people have gotten tired of us talking about that, so I don't want to like go off on it any more than we have. I think we've pretty much said a piece on it. But the reason I bring it up is because it was important to the team making the game as well, to try to get an answer to what they thought Final Fantasy was. Hey everybody, so I'm recording this after having finished the recording with Kason for the podcast. There's a couple of things that I wanted to say that I forgot to mention during the course of us sort of, talking about it. So I'll have a couple of these little addendum sections where I cut in and add a couple of things. But in regards to this discussion about what is Final Fantasy, what's the spirit of Final Fantasy, in that PlayStation Japan interview, the same one where Nomura talked about how Final Fantasy VIII gave him his first opportunity to draw the characters the way he'd always wanted to, right? Not like before. In that same interview, the interviewer asks whether or not Final Fantasy VIII will have an overworld mode. And I really thought Kitase's response to this was kind of funny. He says, yes, of course, a Final Fantasy without a world map isn't a Final Fantasy game. As somebody who has been calling for the return of the old school style of an overworld map in Final Fantasy games, this felt a bit like a vindication to me. Even Kitase in 1998, at the time of this interview, felt that an overworld map was an important piece of the identity of Final Fantasy, enough to have mentioned this, even if it was in sort of a joking manner in this interview. And so, anyways, for those of us who love overworld maps and want to see that return, there at least was a time when Kitase felt the same way. Clearly, that's not the case anymore with Final Fantasy 13 and Final Fantasy 10 and Final Fantasy 7 Remake. But I thought it was a funny quote, so I wanted to throw that in there for you guys. What we're going to get in this game, in Final Fantasy VIII, is Kitase, Nomura, and those lead developers who are still very much in prominent positions in the company. Their answer to what Final Fantasy is versus now, this is for the first time where we're breaking Squaresoft into different divisions, right? Different teams, different units who make Final Fantasy games. And all of a sudden you start seeing very different versions of Final Fantasy pop up. Kitase led Final Fantasy projects like Final Fantasy 8 and 10 and 13 and 7 Remake all share elements that tie them together. They feel like a coherent vision of what Final Fantasy is to him. Versus Yatsumi Matsuno's version of what Final Fantasy is. Versus Sakaguchi's version of what Final Fantasy is. Versus Hiromichi Tanaka's version of what Final Fantasy is with 11 and 14 1.0. Versus Yoshi P's version of what Final Fantasy is with Final Fantasy 14 A Realm Reborn and, of course, the upcoming Final Fantasy 16. The point is that there's lots of different teams with different ideas about what Final Fantasy is, and you can start to see the similarities in style, approach, and philosophy by looking into what they found important and why they did. So, the only other thing that I kind of want to talk about a little bit here is some of the influences. So, with the big sales of Final Fantasy VII, because it was such a global success, and they started more of an outward approach in terms of the audience, right? They started thinking about people outside of Japan a little bit more with Final Fantasy VIII. And a big focus was to create something that would appeal visually to people all around the world. And so a lot of the locations in Final Fantasy VIII are actually inspired by real-world places with architecture from Egypt and Greece and France and a lot of other European countries. They also purposefully designed the characters to look predominantly European for that reason. Quote here, it just felt like more people in the world had a chance to play, not just in Japan. So there wasn't any pressure to make Final Fantasy VIII as successful as as 7 or anything specifically like that, but there was definitely a sense of wanting to make the game appeal to people around the world. So, again, kind of like the art direction, the way that the characters were designed, they were designed on purpose to look a little bit more European than in previous games. Okay, I think that's it for what I want to talk about with the development history section. Do you have anything that you want to add? Any thoughts that you had based on what we were talking about, or anything that I missed in your research?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
Okay.
You're very
So
thorough.
let's move into part 2 of the analysis, which is going to be about summarizing what happened. Okay, what happened in this section we're talking about today? Do you want to handle this? What would be your summary as to
Sure.
the section we played?
So you wake up in bed because you had an awful training session with Cypher, and he's a total jerk, and he's just a very bad person. And this is funny because it's something I didn't understand or notice at first when I first played the game. But it seems like there is a woman next to him who says something like, "Oh, it's good to see you again." She leaves, and he asks about it later on. He doesn't know who the woman is, but there's somebody there. Kind of a little bit of a mystery there. So yeah, he wakes up. He's got his little seed exam, so he goes to class, and his teacher. I always found this funny. His teacher is 1 year older than him, so she's very young. And Kistis, is that how you pronounce it, Kistis?
I say Quistis, but I have no idea how it's supposed to be pronounced. I think Quistis is probably correct.
So, anyways, they go to their school class thing, and it's like they have a final exam going up, and it's a hands-on kind of exam. So you go to this cave, you gotta fight this monster, and as long as you can do it in a certain amount of time, then you pass the test. And,
Gotta fight a monster for
you know,
a quiz.
get a reward, and you just kind of keep going. So after that, the seed people, a seed member is basically just like a young special forces kind of thing where they use magic and summons, and they have all these special abilities that they've learned in this school.
It's kind of like a mercenary school.
Yeah, it's
so
hired. That's right. And
There we
it's
go.
yeah.
So it's like a private militia that gets hired by like different government organizations to like help protect them in their military campaigns. And so there are like several of these gardens.
Different gardens.
And that's the school, right? So the terminology is a garden, and then each individual student is a seed in that garden, right? So that's why it's called seed. And they're essentially a militia for hire, and they train these students in combat military discipline.
Yeah. So whoever has the money, they're the ones that get the seed people on their side. So some city gets attacked. They're under siege for a couple days, and they decide that they can't hold them off anymore, and they, send some money over to Balam Garden is what it's called. And they send over a bunch of seed people, some experts, and then some new trainees, and we're one of the new trainees, right? And so we're under Cypher, and Cypher, who's the bully, right? So he's not very nice to us, but we're like, whatever, we don't really care too much about it. We're also teamed up with this other guy named Zell, who is he's very bothered by Cypher and everything Cypher says and does, and Cypher can get under Zell's skin so easily, basically by doing nothing, calling him chicken wuss, which that was the best insult ever. Whereas Squall just brushes it off, and he's just like, whatever, I don't care. I mean, it gets to him a little inside, but doesn't show it. They get to this place, and Cypher, of course, doesn't want to follow the plan. He wants to do his own thing. But because of that, you have to follow his lead. So, he's the leader of the team. And Squall's kind of itching to do some other stuff too, because what they're assigned to do, and there was really no action where they were. So they decided to make their way up to this tower where a bunch of Galvadian soldiers are positioned outside of it. And they don't really know why. They're like, what are they doing with this tower? So they beat up all the guards, make it up the tower, and it turns out that they've created this. Well, you don't find out exactly what it does till later, I suppose. But there's some crazy technologies that things that are on that tower that are kind of secret that people didn't really know about. And so, you have to fight a boss or two while you're up there, which is Wedge and Biggs, and then some demon thing that shows up. But part of the weapon system that is part of this tower, there's this guardian that's like a spider thing, kind of like the scorpion from 597 that shows up in the first spawning mission. And so you've just got to run away from it because you can damage it all you want, but it self repairs. And so the team gets out of there just in the nick of time, and the Dolette mission is well, at least what we were supposed to do. It was deemed a success, and then you're greatly rewarded. But that's where we stopped, right? Now, is there anything that you think is important that I kind of skipped over?
No, I think you covered it. The rivalry between Cypher and Squall. Essentially, that the Dalek mission was serving as like their final exam. So if they pass this exam, right, then they graduate from being students to being like full military members of the academy, right? So they're being evaluated. Your performance is being evaluated on this mission, and that's kind of cool that they sort of work in an evaluation system into it. How many times? Yeah. If you waste too much time talking to people on your way in, it'll like dock you points, and depending on how many times you fight that spider as it's like chasing you down back to the beach, that'll affect your score. So they sort of work a system within the gameplay itself to judge or evaluate your performance. And anyway, so it's all being evaluated to see if you will graduate to become like full members of Seed. Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a perfect summary. So let's move into style. Let's talk about the style a little bit. This is essentially the pillar, the core of my personal disagreement with the Kitase-led Final Fantasy guys. The guys who he works with, the Nomuras, the Toriyamas, the Kitases of Square Enix. This is where I have a bit of a disconnect with these creators, and that is with style. The style.
Oh wait, that coffee got to be done brewing, huh?
And I want to talk a lot first about a hook, like the importance of a hook in storytelling. We evaluate the hook in Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, and 7, and it seems like it gets better every time. Like they have a really strong hook at the beginning of each of those games that just you go through that opening scene, it's just like holy crap, you're just like they grab you by the collar and they pull you straight into that world and you cannot turn away, right? Whether that's Cecil stealing the crystals, killing innocents in the name of loyalty to the team, and then being demoted and sent away. Whether that's Terra with the crown that's controlling her mind, and they're marching through the snow into Narsh Village with the music, that beautiful music that plays, or whether it's Final Fantasy VII's bombastic sequence with that camera that pulls out and shows the city of Midgard in 3D, and it's the first time you've seen something like this ever. It's holy fetch. And then the train pulls in, you get that bombing mission music, and it's just intense, right?
Yeah.
All of these games have these amazing hooks that just right off the bat.
Talking about the Final Fantasy V intro as well earlier.
Yeah, Final Fantasy V is a great hook, I feel. So, what would you say Final Fantasy VIII's hook is? What would you say?
That's hard to think because, well, okay, so there's the intro movie that you watch.
Yes.
That is beautiful. It really is artistically, brilliant.
Mm.
But it makes no sense, especially to somebody who's never, played the game before. You watch this and you're just like, what am I watching? So as far as the hook goes, that's actually not a very good hook because you don't even know. Like it looks cool. There's a flower field and some words and like don't forget me or whatever, some stuff going on. And then all of a sudden you're fighting Cypher and you just don't know what's happening. You don't even know who Cypher is. And so the hook, gosh, it would have to be the Dalek mission, but that's hours into the game in terms of when they finally ensnare you and say, hey, look, there's something bigger going on, and this is really exciting kind of stuff. I guess it would have to be that mission, but that's so late for a hook.
Okay, so many things you said. First of all, that I totally agree with, but that I am just itching to unpack here. The game's hook, in terms of what they intended to be the hook, is the opening cinematic.
What?
It is that little movie that plays where Cypher and Squall are training and doing a gunblade duel, kind of juxtaposed with all of these this sort of like foreshadowing imagery of things that are going to happen later in the game.
Yeah.
Would it surprise you at all if I told you that Tetsuya Nomura directed that opening cinematic?
Not at all. In fact, I think if I didn't know that, I knew it intuitively already because that is so obviously.
Okay. Now this is where we're talking about style, right? We're talking about style. There's a reason why you knew intuitively, even if you didn't know that was Nomura, because you've seen Kingdom Hearts cutscenes, because you've seen his style elsewhere, and you know the way he goes about presenting visually to play. And I agree with you. I think that the reason why, say, Final Fantasy VII's hook is so effective is because it's not just a cutscene. You are playing, right?
If they could have had you actually fighting Cypher at the beginning in some way, I mean, I feel like that would have been more complete, but they just opted not to do that.
Well, I actually think that whole scene serving as the game's hook with the battle with Cypher is just kind of, it's just, like you said, I think there's a much more effective place to have started. And that is, imagine if the game opened up with that shot of the sea with the moon in reflection and those barges are just going across. And they just crash onto the beach like Normandy, and the barge just slams open, and Squall and team just come running out, and you just start getting the fights like right away. If the game had started with the Dalek mission, instead of what you learn is just a training exercise accident. All right, so one thing I want to interject with here really quick, because I forgot to say this sort of in the bulk of the conversation. There was somebody in the comments section of the original upload of the video who was a little bit perturbed that we would reduce this opening FMV to being nothing more than morning practice. I don't remember the exact wording, but he thought that was some kind of bastardization of the intent of that scene. And so I wanted to read this quote from Yoshinori Kitase to establish that this is essentially what the intention of the scene was. He says, regarding the opening movie, right, so the interviewer is asking about the opening movie, the opening FMV. Says the opening movie is still talked about as one of the best beginnings to a game. What kind of planning went into that? And Kitase's response is that was almost entirely the product of Tetsuya Nomura-san. He came up with the concept and said, I want to do this, drew out the storyboard for us, and directed the scene as well. In Japan, there's a tradition of morning practice. So if you're in a club activity, which is usually sports or something like that, you have practice before school starts in the morning. That scene, it has this whole build-up where it looks like a battle, but you find out actually it was just morning practice. So, I'm just using that to qualify my statement there, that this really just amounts to being morning practice. That was the intention that the developers had behind that scene, to build it up like it was something and then kind of reveal, oh, we're in this school setting.
Yeah, I would have never knew that.
Anyways, just wanted to insert that in there because I had forgotten to do that in the original upload. As big as they try to make that scene in with the opening cinematic, the like totally amazing Uematsu piece happening behind that, like with
it's well done. It's a well done movie, honestly.
Liberty Fatale playing. It's like very epic, and you got the chorus, the choir singing, and this big orchestra. The first piece in the history of the series to have been actually recorded with a real orchestra, by the way.
Nice.
Final Fantasy VII had no real orchestra recording, right? It was all MIDI. All the music was MIDI. So this was the first recorded, like, live orchestra in a
Hmm.
Final Fantasy game, Liberty Fatale. I love that piece. I love that track. It's really great. The thing about it is that I used to listen to that when I was in Vegas, when I was on my mission. I used to listen to that and imagine all of these epic battles in my mind, and I would sort of like block or storyboard in my head like these epic battle sequences to it. And to put that music to what is essentially two guys training, it just feels kind of hollow in comparison to how big and epic this music is. And it's almost meant to feel like, because you don't know that this is a training exercise at all. You're just watching two guys dueling with blades, and it's like, whoa, who are these guys? What's going on here? They're fighting.
Which one's the good guy? Yeah.
And then it's revealed, oh, he was just training and he got caught and it was an accident, or maybe possibly not an accident on a side.
Damn, is that what that
But
was?
still,
I remember this.
they were just training, right?
I
It's
thought
just kind
I
of
thought they were
feels like,
fighting.
ooh, this epicness, and then it's just like, oh, it was just training. And to use that as a hook in place of the Dalit mission. Okay, and so another thing that the chat brought up to me as I was editing the video was that the demo of Final Fantasy VIII actually does start off with the Dalit mission. I did not know that. I never played the demo of Final Fantasy VIII. So it opens up, and this to me was a little bit reminiscent of like the NES Final Fantasy games, with just like an opening paragraph of like background information, kind of like a title crawl in one of the Star Wars movies or something. But it gives a little bit of background to what's happening, and then just starts you right off in the same place that I was talking about, starting off here in the podcast. So it's interesting that in the demo they did start off right there on the Dalit mission. However, I still really feel like it would have been stronger to start off right there, and if they had used Liberty Fatale, the Uematsu track that they used in the opening cinematic of the actual game, if they used that track here as the opening for the Dalit mission. And so I decided to kind of do my own cut of this, right, to put Liberty Fatale behind this and show you guys a version of the opening scene that combines these
Oh
two
shit.
things. So it'd be interesting to see what you guys think about it.
Oh shit. Yo. Yo, this shit look epic. He put that together himself. He didn't even. That's not from the game. He's editing AV from the game. Holy shit.
One pretty interesting comment that I received regarding, this idea of starting the game off in the Dalit mission instead of with the opening FMV sequence was that while Final Fantasy VII's setup and some of these other games in the FF series
Start with the bombing.
start off with something a little bit more exciting, right? There's not as much context that is necessary to understand what's happening in those scenes. So, like, the conversation between Barrett and Cloud about Mako reactors and the planet dying and these sorts of things that they talk about on the elevator going down is pretty much all the context that you need to understand what the goal is here, what's happening. It's not like a high context scene necessarily. And Final Fantasy VIII's Dalit mission is one that probably requires a little bit more setup than that in order to really understand what's going on. And so it could be confusing if we just dropped you straight into the Dalit mission. And so I want to clarify that, anytime I make, this kind of suggestion that maybe the game should start here, that comes with like an obvious caveat that there's going to have to be some adjustments made to the scene in order to lay down some of that context. I actually think that the way that they set it up in the demo, by the way, with just sort of a short paragraph of information that sort of just like gives you a little bit of background, is probably good enough. They could probably add maybe another paragraph or two to that if they wanted to, or just throw in some lines of dialogue between Cypher and Zell and Squall as they're going through the battle, and sort of build it up a little more. Obviously, we wouldn't be just leaving the scene exactly as it is. We would also obviously pepper in some context to help the scene be understood a little better. But I still feel like this would have been a more impactful opening sequence than what they chose to
That
go
should
with.
look great,
So,
especially with the
just
music.
wanted to throw that explanation in there. Now, a lot of people will say, well, they needed to do the tutorial for the GS first, right? Like, but think about Final Fantasy VII. They threw you right into it. They didn't give you a tutorial on materia.
Right.
You still had access to magic. They still had materia equipped, but they hadn't actually given you the tutorial yet on materia. And they allowed you to have limited access to the game's systems, but let you sort of play it and battle and figure it out with the limited tools they offer you in that first mission before they started tutorializing things, before they started getting into the nuts and bolts of teaching you the game. They let you play through a sequence that hooks you into the world, into what's going on, into the characters, for the really exciting sequence. And I feel like the Dullet mission would have been perfect to fit that purpose. Let's talk a little bit about the structure and the style of that introductory cutscene. Right?
Yeah.
Let's just break it down a little bit. What's happening here is that we don't know this yet if you're watching it for the first time, but Cypher and Squall are training. And this is actually the first time they ever used...
I thought they were fine. I didn't know that there was training. I don't recall that memory of like, oh, they're training. I thought they were fighting. Like they used to be friends. I didn't even know it was a.
Sequences, Sephiroth descending, and all those scenes were hand animated.
Whatever.
But with Final Fantasy VIII, they wanted it to look real, so they did motion capture on that Cypher and Squall battle as they're fighting that world. You can tell that was motion capture. There's way too many nuances of the way human bodies move for that to have been hand animated. So they're battling, and then we just have these juxtaposed images. And I want to say, first of all, that the imagery is striking. It's very cool to look at. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's beautiful. Very well done in that regard.
The cinematography, the level of the cinematography is very high. You have like that shot where like the gun blade just comes like swinging down from the clouds of lightning. It's just like slams into the ground. A lot of scenes that we're going to see actually later on in the game, cutscenes from later on. They show Idea and Renoa.
Exactly. They show some of that stuff up front. And so it's kind of, in that sense, it's kind of like a trailer
Yes.
for the game you're playing. You're watching a little trailer of your game.
When this was true at the time, when you would leave the game alone on like the start screen, and then it would eventually just kind of go into like showing you a little demo of the game.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's serving the purpose of being that, and also the game's opening hook at the same time. It's like I'm trying to give you a taste of like all these different parts that are coming later, but at the same time also being the first scene of the game, like simultaneously being the game's first sequence of this training between Cypher, and it's done in this style that is very predominantly Nomura Kitase's way of sort of like there's a spectacle to it. There is a I don't know how to say it other than like a weight visually to it that suggests this depth that they're promising to you.
Yeah.
It definitely sets the mood for the game. And I feel like it actually does that quite well. It sets the mood for the game, while maybe not being the best hook.
But I think that's actually a very good point. It sets an atmosphere. It gives you a feeling that they're trying to communicate.
That's what I remember. You were fighting this guy.
Developers are trying to communicate emotionally to you.
Yeah.
However, I feel like that imagery is mostly.
All right. I just want to talk so that way I'm not talking over them. Yeah, see, so like I said, I'm like 10 years old watching Final Fantasy VIII for the first time. Maybe I'm 11. And I remember watching and that opening sequence thinking like, oh, this is uh like two guys who they're fighting, so they're enemies, but they're friends. I don't know why I had the idea that they were friends, if I got that from the video or just from like the background of like these guys know each other. So it was like, background information just outside of the game of like, oh, these guys know each other, so they're friends, but they're fighting each other. So, okay, this obviously takes place later in the story of when these two guys are fighting. And it's maybe like their first fight, kind of like a Naruto Sasuke thing where it's like it's their first fight against each other. Something like that. And, that's when they bloody each other, they scar each other on the face and things like that. And honestly, that's what I always thought was happening in there. I thought it was like these guys were friends, but they're not friends anymore, and they're fighting. And, they're pretty equal to one another because they scarred each other. So now it's like this friendly rivalry that became a big rivalry. And I thought for a second that maybe it had something to do with the girl. I believe her name's Luna, but I could be wrong about that. But the girl character, where they might have been fighting over her. I was even thinking about that, but at that time I was like getting into girls and things like that. So I could just be imagining that. But I remembered thinking like, no, these guys are enemies at this point. So when we started the game, I didn't think of them as like friends. But again, we're going so far back. We're going 20 plus years ago. So it's like, I don't recall everything. But I'm like learning, listening to these guys. And that's why I like watching stuff like this. Is because like, yeah, I have my ideas of Final Fantasy VIII. It was always like a big deal in my head because of the time that it came out and the time of where I was in my life. And yeah, to learn about it this way is like, because I had no idea about any of this stuff. This is super interesting. So yeah, I just wanted to cut it off to just say like they're talking about the opening a lot. And yeah, I don't know, after seeing what that guy put together in his own edit, like, yeah, that seems like they could have did something better in the beginning. Thoughts I never would have had as a 10-year-old. But yeah, let me continue.
Okay, so in light of a lot of comments that I got on the original upload of this video regarding my feelings about the opening FMV, I know that a lot of people are thinking in their minds about a late game connection, right? Information that you get at the end of the game that informs what a lot of people interpret the beginning FMV sequence is hinting at, or that it's maybe incorporating. Just keep in mind, I'm not spoiling the end of the game here. So I'll be returning at the end of the podcast to talk about my feelings about the opening FMV again, but this time in light of everything that we know by the end of the game. So yes, I'm aware of what a lot of you are thinking. I will talk about it eventually, but no spoilers for now. So I can't talk about it at this moment.
Okay.
But I will talk about it again at the end. So let's talk a little bit about the text that comes on screen. So it starts off pushing out into the ocean. The camera's pushing out into the ocean. And some words come on screen. And I wrote down the dialogue here. It's so hard to explain how differently it feels when you're like watching it unfold versus just like really paying attention to what it says. The way I'm just going to read you what the text says. And I want to get your opinion on how it lands differently for you watching it in the game versus actually just examining what the text says.
Hmm.
I'll be here. Why? I'll be waiting here. For what? I'll be waiting for you. So, if you come here, you'll find me, I promise.
Now, what do you want me to say?
I just want to get your opinion on it.
Heavy implications for the end of the game, for like the final, end of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, let's not spoil anything. I guess we'll just say this. This is a conversation that is going to happen later in the game. So,
Yes.
this is a conversation that we will revisit. So, keep this in mind if you're playing this game for the first time. This text.
But my gosh, and luckily for me, I mean, after playing the game, they kind of do show basically the same cutscene again, and it just makes a little bit more sense this time. But there's no way you're keeping that in mind as you play the game.
Here's the reason why stylistically I don't find dialogue like this to be very effective, but it is the kind of thing that Nomura does all the time in Kingdom Hearts 2. It's a reason why I really struggle why those games don't resonate with me.
Mm.
This is a conversation that's going to happen later in the game. We don't know that as a first-time player. It's just dialogue. Dialogue should be communicating something to us. It should be giving us context as to what's happening here. If we're just looking at the dialogue, and this is coming again from a writer's perspective. I'm taking a creative writing course right now. I've taken many in the past. One of the things that they will hammer into your brain is to avoid repetitions. It's a really big thing in writing to not just repeatedly say the same things over and over again. It gets fatiguing. It starts to diminish the impact of the words, and it's just like, okay, get to the point. This dialogue is essential when you break it down. Character A saying, I'll be waiting, and character B saying, huh? 3 times. 3 times! They say the same thing. And it doesn't lead anywhere. There is no revelation. There is no information communicated in that dialogue. It is a repetition of essentially nothing we can draw any context from.
And that was my initial kind of feeling about it, was that, especially as a hook, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And so, knowing that, as the director, programmer, whoever's making this, knowing that you're putting something in the game at the beginning that doesn't make sense, but looks cool. Maybe it was a marketing decision. I don't know.
Now this is about setting up mysteries, right?
Sure.
Like and I can't stress enough that the way, the style in which this is presented suggests like that this is really dramatic and serious and important.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
I remember
but
that.
The funny thing is the mystery shouldn't be, what the fetch are they talking about? That shouldn't be the mystery. I mean, I shouldn't say should or shouldn't, right? Because we're not going to be that specific in our critiques. But I would say that may miss the mark a little bit. Because if people don't even know what they're talking about, they're not going to hold it in their minds at the end of the game.
Yeah, and this intention of it being really deep and dramatic and profound is represented with all the ellipses, all the dots after everything.
Yeah.
It suggests this tone in which it's being spoken of being very serious. I'll be here. This airiness, this weight. Why? I'll be waiting, in quotes. Here. For what? I'll be waiting. For you. So. If you come here. You'll find me, I promise. It's just so over the top in terms of the style, without saying anything That is meaningless dialogue for the context in which we are being presented right now. That doesn't mean anything. It's just suggesting, guys, it's essentially the developer just being like, I promise you, that's going to be important later. There's going to be something real serious and dramatic in this game, I promise you. Just wait for it. Instead of like actually suggesting what.
Anything else, it just sets a mood. It just makes you feel something as opposed to being actually relevant or important at all.
This is where the term, I think, that's used a lot in Kingdom Hearts, feels over reels comes from. It hits you in the feels. You feel the intention behind it. But like when you think about it, what is it actually saying? So there's a lot of that going on in this introductory cinematic movie thing, and it's a lot of like a lot of it to me feels very random in terms of the imagery that they show. It doesn't like what's actually happening. What is literally happening is Cypher and Squall are fighting each other. Squall's gunplay did not fall from the freaking stratosphere and crash into the ground, and then he picked it up and started fighting with it. He pulled it out of his freaking like little gun case that he carries, or whatever. That a lot of this is not. It's not literal imagery. It's not literally happening. It's just done for style's sake. Style for style's sake, without really like thinking about how this genuinely or literally applies to the scene which happened, which is why it feels more like a demo that plays on a start screen than it does like the actual first scene of the game. But it is the first scene of the game because the second scene of the game is Squall waking up in the infirmary and being like, "Oh, you had an accident in training, you got sliced up, and now we patched you up to go back to school." This is one of the things that.
You know what that's making me sound like? What they're kind of being, what they're critiquing on right now is, we're all familiar with Final Fantasy VII, hopefully the original. If you're not, I'll just say it real quick. There's a scene later on in the game where like Cloud is in a wheelchair and he's like, revisiting memories. He doesn't know who he is. Da da da. Like he's in a haze. Cloud is like in this real hazy place. It's really weird and moody and things, and feels and reels like they were just talking about. It's more feels than reels, but it's like Cloud's like coming back, and it's like, God damn it, can't we just get Cloud back, please? Like, I just want to get back to the game. Like, why are we rolling around in a wheelchair in this weird place? Like, can we whatever. Get me out of here. It sounds like what's crazy is that this, imagine if Final Fantasy VII started like that instead of the train sequence. We get this awesome train sequence that leads to like an explosion, boss fight and an explosion. It's awesome. Imagine if you had started in that weird wheelchair place. I forget what it's called and all that, but when Cloud is like out of it and all that. Like, yeah, it's a major part of the game. It's super important. I'm not saying like don't put that in there, but it happens like way later into the game. Like you're so far into the game at that point, like it's just something that's happening. Where this game is just starting and it's just now trying to get you on, and yeah, just interesting because again, this game, I don't really recall any of this stuff, so they're bringing it up, and it's like remembering it, and now I'm getting like the perspective of like professionals and things like that, and adults, not just my 10-year-old brain being like, cool swords.
Sakaguchi's approach and style, Kitase in the words. And it is something that we will see more of, not just in this game, but in the series. And so you have to kind of take that, you have to kind of like say, okay, this is what they're going for. And when you have that in mind, right, and you realize this isn't going to be told quite the same way as what I'm used to in previous games or whatever it may be, you kind of have to try to get into their mindset with this. Okay, they're trying to communicate a tone to me. What is that tone? Does the tone work? Now, does it work? This is something I really want to stress. If you go on YouTube and you just look up Final Fantasy VIII opening sequence, and you go into the comments section and you look at the like to dislike ratio, people freaking love this sequence. They love it. People think it is awesome because, to a certain extent, it is awesome. Visually, it's really cool to watch, and the music is
It
amazing.
is technically very impressive. Yes.
And the animation is like just unbelievably cool. It's a very, very cool sequence.
And even the creativity, the montage like blending of reality with what can't possibly be real. I mean, it's very creative as well, very unique in that
Yeah.
sense.
All right, so one more thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the style of the opening cinematic is some of the symbolism that they're using. There's very much this feather motif that they have going on. And it's important to note that it seems with this shot where Squall sort of like swings the blade, and then it kind of kicks up all these feathers, and then the camera pushes through that, and you see the angel wings that are sort of like hemmed into the back of Renoa's vest. It seems that they're making a connection between the feather symbol and Renoa as a character. Now, what that represents, I mean, it's probably true that she's supposed to be like this angelic type figure for Squall, right? Someone who, character in a way like brings him out of his shell. He's sort of on this path of reclusiveness, resistance to becoming the leader and the man that he needs to be, and that she's an important figure in sort of drawing him out of that, right? I think that that's more or less what that's meant to symbolize. So I thought it was important to at least make a note of that as we're looking at the construction of this opening cinematic. But clearly, for a great majority of people who played the game, they freaking loved it, right? So just want to put that out there. One thing I also want to mention, though, and this was kind of cool to learn, the scene where Squall and Renoa fall into each other's arms right at the end of that sequence, which is, again, a scene that's going to happen later. That is essentially where the inspiration for the logo of the game came from, right? With Squall and Renoa holding each other behind the Final Fantasy VIII title. And Amano said that the reason he chose the color scheme he did, which is kind of that yellow to orange, warm, sort of like gradient, is because of the sunset behind them as they're falling into each other's arms in that cutscene. The music was awesome, though. I didn't know if you knew this, but that livery Fatali track was used in the Olympics in 2004, I think, for synchronized swimming. There was a team in the synchronized swimming event that used livery Fatali as the music. So it's really good. It's really, really good. I can't stress enough. I really like that. I really like the music overall in Final Fantasy VIII. But to wrap up our discussion of the style, aside from this sort of way that they go about presenting their dramatic sort of tone and some of the issues that I have.
All right. Well, are we focused? There we go. So to end out this stream, because here we are at 2 hours, my coffee's already getting cold. Oh shit, going on 3 hours. Another stream. Finished inking the bottom, colored them all, and obviously green is going to be this guy's main color, but I wanted to play with blue and purple because I wanted blue and purple to be his main color, something like this scheme here. But I did so much blue and purple for the characters, and maybe I should because they're all a part of the same part of the world, so maybe there's like a blue and purple thing going on there. But I just wanted to get away from that color, so I made him green. Because of part of the world that he represents and things like that. So it's like, okay, so green works. And then I can, I can throw blue and purple in there. That's why I gave him the blue gloves. And as soon as I did that, I loved it. I think it was like maybe here or here that I threw the blue gloves on the first time on him. And I was just like, oh, that's it. That's it. His gloves are always gonna be blue no matter what. Gonna make them green, give him blue gloves, and I'll try to throw in purple wherever I can. And yeah, so I did a little bit of purple, but when I was looking up belts and stuff like that, I saw these really cool belts that had like red tips at the end. Don't know what it means, but I just thought it was really cool, and the red would offset with the green really well. So then that's when I started introducing red into this guy's color scheme, but still I wanted to maintain that green as his main color. The blue is going to be iconic with his character, and then now it's like, okay, the purple and red are kind of sprinkled in there, and I could always play around with these colors some more. It's just me working on concepts for now, and I'm just zooming through this character, and I love it. I'm gonna be working on more stuff like this, and I have a lot more humanoid characters, so I can't wait to get to them, because yeah, all the characters I've been working on are monsters, and as much as I try to like get my monsters to look and feel a certain way, like this guy, uh, you know, I threw like rags and clothing and seashells on him. It was like, okay, that that's what's going on with him, but it's not. It's more singular to him, where characters like this are going to be a little bit more um, in play with what I'm trying to do here. And I love this setup because this is where I'm comfortable with drawing things, um, at least with the concepts and throwing ideas out there. Of course, what I truly love to do is draw giant, larger pictures of characters. So to take these concepts and then to blow them up to a size like this big, where I can really get in there with some details and break them down and things like that. I thought I'd be doing that with this character, but I really wanted to attack different clothing types and styles, and I don't need to do all that detail for that. And then I'd love to like work on pictures even bigger, and really get like details and things like this. So I'm gonna work my way up the production, and maybe one day I'll actually be drawing these characters at this scale with this detail and things like that. But that's just not what's in the cards right now. Right now it's all about just getting ideas on the page. It's concept design, baby. This is what we do. You got to get those ideas out of your brain and onto the paper. And that's what I do as an artist, and that's what it takes. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. 3 hours deep. It's probably like mad late. It's already noon. Shit. I overslept this morning, and had to catch up on sleep, I guess. But I'm feeling great though. Either way, I'm G Mr. Drew. That's at G Mr. Drew on all social media. Go follow, like, and subscribe. I'm re-quoting, retweeting things on Twitter to share like things that I follow and things that I find interesting, giving just like small insight, kind of like I'm doing with this Final Fantasy VIII video in the background. But obviously, it's much more limited and less rambly, so that you can benefit from that there. YouTube, I put all my old videos there. They get immortalized onto YouTube, so you can watch those there. And then what else? Yeah, jmrdrew.art, my website. All this artwork and concept design is public, and I put that up there on there, so that way it's my portfolio, it's my work, and da 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 da, and it's what I use to try to get jobs and try to work for people, and yeah, I need more help with that, man. If you're watching this and you think like I might be a good fit with something, or if you just want to hire me yourself, man, definitely hit me up. Links are everywhere, all over the place. So it shouldn't be hard to contact me. But yeah, gmrdrew.art is my website. You can hit me up through there. And yeah, man, I want to thank you all for watching the latest episode, the Andrew Glowczewski Experience, episode 110. We're already 10 episodes deep. I remember I made a big deal out of 100, lost that episode, and then I just cruised past it, and now here we are 10 episodes later. I feel like 200's right around the corner then. And yeah, working on more character concept art. I'll probably be continuing it just because I'm having a lot of fun with this, and I'm happy to be working on a human character, so something that's more recognizable and takes less thought and less ideas and more, you know what I mean, like characters like this where I'm like really playing with anatomy and things like that, and I have to like really get these ideas out in order for me to understand them later on down the line. These are a little bit more straightforward, so I get to have a lot more fun and I get to play loose and fast with them. And instead of doing one in a 3 hour video, I'll do four, or eight, or whatever it is. So yeah, having fun. I'll probably continue this guy and just like get this page done, move forward, and who knows, maybe work on some other stuff. But either way, uh, yeah, man. Thanks for tuning in. I love y'all. Peace.